The battlefield lay silent, fathers and brothers cut down, but their daughters still breathed. And for the Ottomans, that meant conquest was not finished. It had only just begun. With women as the final prize, the swords were sheathed. But their nightmare was only starting. The victors ignored the corpses. Their eyes turned to the survivors, the daughters of nobles, chieftains, warriors. They were prizes, symbols, leverage. Alive, they were more useful than their fallen fathers. Some tried to hide among the dead, smearing blood on their faces. But soldiers dragged them out, stripped of dignity, marked for capture. A daughter's noble birth meant nothing now. But where were they being taken? Bound in ropes, they were marched past burning villages. The screams of mothers echoed. The Ottomans didn't slaughter them, they transformed them into spoils of war, human trophies carried into foreign lands. Every step stripped them further from their past. Their names, titles, and families were already erased. In Ottoman hands, they were no longer daughters of warriors. They were property. Some whispered prayers, others vowed revenge. But all knew the truth. Return was impossible. Their fathers had fallen, their homes gone. The only path forward was captivity, and whatever horrors waited there. But captivity wasn't always chains. Sometimes it was silk. The march stretched for miles. Bare feet bled on sharp stones. Each stumble earned a whip crack. For noble daughters, pain was now the only reminder they were still alive. Some tried to whisper songs of home, clinging to memory, but guards silenced them. Even voices were forbidden. Their noble identities weren't just stripped away, they were methodically erased. The women passed charred villages. Mothers who once ruled halls now trudged like slaves, clutching daughters. Smoke stung their eyes, but it was the stares of their captors that burned deeper. A river crossing nearly drowned the weakest. Guards dragged them by hair, laughing as they gasped for breath. Mercy was absent. Survival demanded enduring humiliation worse than death. At night, there was no rest. Camps reeked of sweat, smoke, and fear. Guards ate while women were forced to sleep in mud, chained to each other like livestock. Some prayed under their breath, others plotted impossible escapes. But every dawn the march resumed. With each step, hope thinned. The path forward was not freedom. It was the Sultan's dominion, but captivity meant different fates, and not all would share the same one. Arrival at the Ottoman camp. Spiked palisades, roaring fires, soldiers feasting. The women, broken and silent, were displayed like cattle. Their worth would now be measured in silver and status. Guards dragged them before commanders. Eyes studied age, beauty, and health. Each flaw lowered value. Each tear revealed vulnerability. Their lives were no longer stories, just calculations of flesh and coin. Some daughters were marked for the Sultan's court, others for concubinage. The unlucky were destined for slave markets far away, where their lineage meant nothing, only their bodies did. The youngest cried for mothers who would never come. Guards laughed, mocking their innocence. Childhood had ended the moment soldiers stormed their halls. Now they belonged to men they despised. Those chosen for transport were forced into carts. Shackled hands gripped wooden rails as villages disappeared behind them. The last glimpse of home vanished into smoke and dust. For some, rivers led to the sea. Wooden ships waited, decks ready for human cargo. The women realized they weren't captives of a single village. They were merchandise for an empire. But once they reached the heart of empire, captivity changed into something even darker. Darkness swallowed them below deck. Chains clinked with every shift. Lanterns swayed, casting sickly light on pale faces. The air was thick. Salt, sweat, and despair blended into suffocating silence. When storms struck, terror spread. Waves slammed the ship, water pouring in. Some prayed, others screamed. But guards lashed those who panicked. Nature itself seemed to conspire against the broken daughters of defeat. At last, dawn revealed Istanbul. Domes gleamed, minarets pierced the sky. The city seemed otherworldly, but to the captives its beauty was a warning. The empire was watching. Dragged through crowded streets, they became a spectacle. Merchants paused, children pointed, nobles glanced with indifference. For the women, every stare was another chain, binding them deeper into humiliation. The group split. Some herded toward the Sultan's palace, cloaked in gold and marble. Others pushed toward slave markets. Their fate depended on whims, luxury prison or nameless bondage. Both were cages. one noble daughter froze before the palace gates. Her eyes wide, her breath trembling. This was no sanctuary. It was the mouth of a gilded prison, swallowing her lineage whole. Inside those walls, the daughters of kings would learn their fate was worse than death. The palace gates closed, sealing their fate. Echoes of footsteps on polished marble replaced the chaos outside. For the daughters of warriors, beauty here was not protection. It was the weapon against them. Silken garments were torn away, their names replaced by numbers. In registers inked by scribes, proud daughters became property. Their lineage erased by a single stroke of calligraphy, binding them to anonymity forever. They were examined like livestock.
Hands tugged at hair, eyes inspected teeth. Rank and heritage meant nothing.
In this hall, beauty determined value and youth was weighed heavier than dignity. Some were chosen for the Sultan's harem, promised silk and silver but watched every moment. A palace of luxury on the surface, yet inside it was another prison gilded with gold. Others were paraded in slave markets.
Strangers haggled over them like spices or horses. Silver weighed against suffering.
Every bid was another humiliation, a reminder that their lives had been auctioned away. Onlookers marveled at jewels ripped from their fingers, unaware those treasures once symbolized kingdoms. Now stripped and silenced, these daughters stood powerless as strangers claimed both their bodies and their histories. Some buyers sought wives, others sought servants. The cruelest sought trophies, proof of conquest displayed in flesh. The women, once symbols of dynasties, were reduced to prizes for men drunk on victory. Behind palace doors, whispers carried darker rumors. Noble daughters forced to entertain courtly guests, their silence bought with fear. Every smile demanded was a mask, hiding the fracture of their spirit. Some resisted. Defiance was punished swiftly. A glance too proud, a word too sharp, and chains tightened. The empire had little patience for the dignity of defeated daughters. Others attempted escape, slipping into alleys at night. Few succeeded. Those captured alive returned branded, their punishment carved not into parchment, but into their very flesh for all to see. Whispers spread of noble daughters taken far east, traded across deserts to Persia or Arabia. Their fates vanished into silence, absorbed by empires that valued their bloodline only as currency. The lucky few became bargaining chips, ransomed back for gold or land. Yet even then they returned broken, their honor used as currency in someone else's ruthless game. Every hall echoed with weeping, but behind it all was silence, the silence of erased names. Their histories vanished, replaced by ledgers and contracts that remembered only silver, never blood. At night, some whispered to each other in secret, clutching memories of home.
A lullaby, a prayer, a hidden word.
It was rebellion in its smallest, most fragile form. But rebellion had a cost. Servants who aided captives disappeared. Guards doubled their watch. Fear spread not only among the women, but among those who dared pity them. The Sultan's court thrived on this suffering. To him, these women were not daughters of kings. They were symbols, reminders that empires fed themselves on the humiliation of rivals. Their youth was spent in captivity, but time itself was another captor. Age reduced their value. Forgotten in shadowed rooms, they vanished from records, leaving only silence in the empire's archives. For every feast of victory, there was a hidden feast of sorrow. Noble daughters across empires bore the silent burden, their lineage consumed by walls that refused to release them. The slave markets thrived on their despair. Each sale funded new conquests, each coin minted from someone's tears. The cycle ensured that the daughters of the defeated would never escape history's jaws. And yet, some endured. Their resilience whispered in forgotten chronicles. Surviving was itself an act of rebellion, even when survival meant living in silence, carrying scars invisible to the empire's gaze. By torchlight, the scribes inked more names into registers.
Another daughter, another transaction.
History preserved not their voices, but their price. Their humanity disappeared into ledgers written by hands of conquest. Some were forced to bear children, their bloodline absorbed into the empire that destroyed their fathers. Even in motherhood, they had no claim, only the knowledge their sons would serve another master. Through it all, their voices rarely survived. The chronicles recorded conquests, victories, treasures, but not the cries of daughters whose fates were treated as footnotes, erased by deliberate silence. Yet silence holds power. Every forgotten daughter is a ghost in the empire's triumphs, a shadow in its riches. Their absence whispers louder than any record, haunting every hall they once walked. But what awaited noble daughters deeper inside the
Palace would scar their souls far worse than
chains? Morning began with silence. No greetings, no names.
only commands shouted by unit guards.
For noble daughters, every dawn was not a gift, it was the renewal of their captivity. They learned quickly. Obedience meant survival. A bowed head, lowered eyes, and quiet footsteps could mean fewer lashes. Even submission became currency, traded for a day with less pain. Food was not nourishment, but control. Portions withheld, bowls overturned at whim. Hunger was another chain, gnawing at their bodies, reminding them daily of dependence on those who conquered them. Their beauty became spectacle. Forced baths, painted faces, silks draped like costumes. They were paraded as trophies, living reminders to courtiers that conquest meant possession, not just of land, but lineage. For those selected to serve the Sultan directly, fear doubled. Every gesture was rehearsed, every word calculated. A misstep before him could mean banishment, or an execution disguised as accident. Some daughters resisted through silence. They refused to sing, refused to smile. That silence became their armor, the only weapon left to shield a shred of identity from erasure. Others defied by memory. They whispered their fathers' names at night, teaching each other family songs. Their captors could strip titles, but could not silence the blood that still remembered. But defiance came at a cost. Whispers carried by spies reached guards. A song could vanish a woman by morning, her absence unrecorded, her silence folded into the empire's triumphs. Some were forced into teaching, their noble upbringing twisted into lessons for the Sultan's children, royal etiquette, foreign languages, courtly grace, ironically preparing the very heirs of the empire that enslaved them. Even in servitude, they were watched. Every gesture weighed, every glance recorded.
Trust didn't exist, only constant suspicion.
To live here was to perform endlessly, never truly breathe. For some, death seemed the only escape. Rumors told of women throwing themselves from palace walls, their final act of defiance staining marble steps with the price of freedom. And yet, survival itself became resistance. Each day endured was a stolen victory. Every breath taken in captivity was defiance, a life wrested from an empire that tried to consume them. Punishments grew more creative.
Hours locked in darkness.
Forced, kneeling on cold stone. Their suffering was theatre for guards who mistook breaking women's bodies for demonstrations of imperial order. Sometimes they were displayed like spoils, forced to appear in court ceremonies dressed in finery stolen from their own homelands, symbols of conquest paraded for all to admire and mock. Their beauty, once celebrated in their kingdoms, became a curse here. Each compliment was a threat, each gaze another reminder they existed not as people, but possessions to be admired. Years passed like this. Some faded into obscurity, others hardened into silent survivors. Either path led to the same truth. They were ghosts haunting a palace that never called their names. Yet every ghost left a trace. Scribbles hidden in margins of manuscripts.
A song carried by servants.
Fragments that prove they were not erased, only deliberately silenced. And always the question lingered. What became of them after the palace doors closed forever? The chronicles speak of conquest, but the daughters of defeat remain shadows between the lines. Their suffering was not random cruelty, it was deliberate strategy. By breaking noble women, the Ottomans shattered dynasties, ensuring conquered kingdoms would never rise again through heirs or alliances. The empire's strength was not only measured in land or armies, it was measured in silence, the silence of noble daughters whose voices were stolen to fuel imperial glory. Yet silence is never perfect. Servants whispered their names, travelers carried rumors. Even within chains, noble daughters carved themselves into memory, refusing to vanish completely into empire's darkness. Some bore children who rose to power. Princes with half-forgotten mothers reshaped courts, proving that bloodlines, even broken, still carried echoes of kingdoms empires thought they had erased. But for most, the story ended unseen. Bones buried beneath palaces, nameless graves forgotten by chronicles. Their silence is louder than any battle, because it was built on stolen voices. Their fate was never written in victory songs, only in shadows. Every conquest had two stories, one of celebration and one buried alive behind palace doors. Guess which survived. But the cruelest fate wasn't captivity, it was how noble daughters were used to rewrite dynasties themselves. Marriage was not union, it was conquest repeated. Noble daughters were given to generals, pashas, or governors. Their lineage dissolved into Ottoman bloodlines, turning queens into concubines, and princesses into bargaining chips. Every child born from them was a reminder, a dynasty reshaped by the blood of those once defeated, ensuring empires didn't just conquer lands, they absorbed the very families they destroyed. They became ghosts within palaces their fathers once defended. No banners carried their symbols, no songs praised their names. History swallowed them, while their children were raised as sons of conquest. Some were forced into alliances abroad, sent as gifts to distant courts, Mamluks, Persians, even European nobles, where they lived as reminders that defeat followed them no matter where they were exiled. Their very silence was weaponized. A daughter who bore children never spoke her true name again. She became mother of someone else, her identity deliberately erased by imperial design. For others, marriage never came. They were kept as concubines, endless tokens of conquest, hidden in gilded cages, their futures dictated by who, among the powerful, claimed them first. These daughters once carried the pride of kingdoms. Now they carried dynasties on their backs, their children growing into princes who never knew the kingdoms their mothers had been stolen from. Some dared whisper their origins to their children, a family crest drawn in dust, a lullaby in forbidden tongue. But every whisper risked punishment that silenced bloodlines forever. Dynasties built on conquest looked unshakable, but within them silent rebellions grew. Children who inherited their mother's spirit sometimes turned into rulers who remembered blood their fathers sought to erase. But for most noble daughters, remembrance was forbidden. They lived as shadows, faces shown in portraits, names erased from chronicles, their entire existence reduced to gift, wife, or concubine. To the empire, they were symbols of legitimacy. To their kingdoms, they were proof of defeat. But to themselves, they were ghosts carrying two worlds that never reconciled. Ceremonies celebrated empire's growth. Behind every feast was a stolen life. Each toast to conquest ignored the silent rows of daughters who had been consumed to make those victories possible. They were never martyrs in chronicles, never warriors in poems. They existed only in margins, seen by all, remembered by none, erased into dynasties that thrived on their disappearance. Even their graves betrayed them. Buried under foreign banners, their stones bore no family crests. They died as daughters of no one, women erased twice, once in life, once in death. Every victory carved in marble hid this truth. Behind statues of sultans, invisible chains stretched back to the noble daughters whose lives were the mortar holding empires together. Their legacy was whispered, not written. A lullaby, a jewel hidden in a gown seam, a prayer spoken in secret tongues. Resistance lived in fragments small enough to survive, but the empire had no need for ghosts. When daughters aged, they were discarded. Those too old for bearing heirs vanished quietly, replaced by newer trophies from fresher conquests. Their worth ended when their youth did. Forgotten, some lived in cloisters within the palace, alive but erased, like relics tucked away in dusty corners of forgotten chambers.
And still they endured.
Not as queens, not as daughters, but as living proof that conquest devoured even nobility, stripping titles until nothing remained but survival itself. Their stories were deliberately buried, but bones unearthed centuries later tell the truth. Foreign women, high-born once, now artifacts in tombs that claimed their lives but never their origins. The empire silenced them, but silence is never eternal. Every forgotten daughter lingers in history's shadows, waiting to remind us that conquests were not only about land, but about people consumed. Ask yourself, when we glorify conquests, whose voices do we silence? Behind every empire's glory lies the story of women whose lives were erased to make those empires possible. The fate of noble daughters wasn't romance, wasn't survival, it was absorption. They vanished into dynasties until history itself forgot where conquest ended and captivity began. The chronicles speak of battles won, but the truest victories were written in silence, in erased daughters, in bloodlines forced to become the empire's foundation stones. But what happened when the empire itself began to collapse? For some daughters, vengeance returned across generations. Empires believed themselves eternal. But dynasties built on silence always crack. The Ottoman world that consumed daughters of kings would one day face the same erasure it inflicted. When rebellions rose, they carried the blood of both conquerors and the conquered. Sons of stolen daughters sometimes turned against the empire their mothers were forced to build. Every conquest planted seeds of vengeance. A daughter erased in one generation could become the silent fire fueling uprisings decades later. Blood remembers what chronicles try to forget. The fall of empires does not erase the suffering they caused.
It only uncovers it.
Buried voices resurface when stone walls finally collapse into dust. Historians began to notice patterns. Graves of noble women far from their homelands. Bones carrying foreign ancestry, proof that empires fed on the bloodlines of those they conquered. Every necklace unearthed, every inscription rediscovered was a voice breaking centuries of silence. These daughters, once erased, whispered back into history through fragments left in the ground. But even today, most remain unnamed. They exist in footnotes, in skeletal reports, in quiet museum displays. The empire erased them once. Modern indifference erases them again. Imagine being a daughter of kings, buried beneath foreign soil, your story reduced to a relic under glass. Would silence feel like death or something far worse? Conquest ended, but its scars remained. Every erased daughter is a reminder that empires are not only measured in land and gold, but in lives consumed. Ask yourself, when we remember conquests, do we remember the kings or the daughters? History favors the victors, but the victims leave echoes we still hear if we listen. The chronicles wrote of triumph, but the truest stories were carried in lullabies, whispered by mothers whose kingdoms were burned and whose names were forbidden. These women were not warriors, yet their survival was rebellion. Every breath taken in silence, every child born in captivity was defiance against conquest itself. Centuries later, their blood still flows in unexpected places. Nobility erased in chronicles survived in DNA, hidden in the veins of people who never knew their royal ancestry. When empires crumble, memory becomes power. Noble daughters return not as names in chronicles, but as haunting reminders of the cost of conquest on human lives. Their stories are not myths. They are evidence. They are ledgers of blood and silver. Bones beneath marble, whispers hidden in chronicles that tried to erase them. History glorifies kings, but the truth of conquest lies in the daughters who lost everything. To forget them is to repeat the same silence that empires enforced. Every empire falls, but every forgotten woman leaves behind a question. Did conquest truly win if memory itself rises from the ashes to expose its crimes? For noble daughters, survival was not life. It was endurance. And endurance is a form of power even empires could never fully crush. This is their legacy, not gold, not banners, but a silence heavy enough to outlast every stone palace that once confined them. And so, the empire that erased them now stands remembered not for its conquests, but for the daughters it consumed, and the voices it failed to silence forever. When you hear of conquest, remember every victory carried the price of women's lives, stolen futures, and silenced names. That is the empire's truest legacy. The noble daughters were erased in chronicles, but not in truth. Their lives remain echoes, reminders that conquest is never clean. It is always written in blood and silence. They were stolen, silenced, erased.
But in remembering them, we break the empire's victory.
Because memory is rebellion, and every story told revives the voices they tried to destroy. The daughters of the defeated were not forgotten. They are watching us still. Their silence was empire's victory. Their remembrance is ours.